For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. So merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley, oh.
This is Martin's Cove. The Sun family have always maintained that this was Martin's Cove. Some historians have disputed that, but it's been confirmed through President Hinckley that this really is. Some wonderful things have happened here, including what happened here in 1856, although there was a lot of tragedy here. It's a great testimony to the survival of the Mormon spirit. As the pioneers came up this side of the cove, they came up here for the reason that they wanted to get out of the wind. There was wood here that they could cut for fires. They had different theories. Some of them thought they'd stay here the whole winter. As it turned out, they were here, some journals say 9 days, some say 11, but they were here more than a week. There was over, the Martin Company was 576 people, and then the Hunt and the Hodgett people were about another 500, so there was over 1,000 people in here. And when you look at it, you don't think you could put 1,000 people in here, but we've had several thousand people in here, and it doesn't even make a dent in the area. The problems that the Martin people faced, as we can best tell, when you read the journals, they said that they couldn't pound the tent stakes into the ground. Well, you see this tall grass, and you see how rich and green it is as it goes down the draw. The reason it grows that tall and like that is because there's a spring that comes down and runs through there. And the problem that the Martin people had is when they came in here in the wintertime, on certain days you don't get a lot of direct radiant sun in here because the walls of the cove are pretty tall. So they didn't have that. They were camped on top of a frozen iceberg. This was all frozen. And they could not get away from the cold. There was 56 that died here and were buried someplace in this cove or on the other side of the cove. We've had some wonderful experiences here. For whatever reason, maybe it was because I'd been here as a youngster, I never had as strong of feelings about the Martin sites as I do the Willie sites. And when we came here as a stake presidency and with our high council, we would come and I just didn't feel the same feelings that I did at the Willie sites. And so I wondered, is this the right place? Even though it was tradition in the Sun family, I wondered if we were really where we were supposed to be. I brought the high council once and their wives and our bishops. We also brought a lady by the name of Donna Olson, who we called to be our secretary. She served as our secretary all the years we've been in because of all the letters we get. She has a doctorate, but she also takes shorthand. She's a single sister and has done a wonderful job we dictate letters to her and she writes them up for us and answers them. I brought her because she's a direct descendant of John Isaac Wardle, who's a member of the Martin Company. I didn't want to ruin it for her because, like most Martin people, they are very defensive about their ancestry and they're very proud of it, as they should be. And so I didn't want to say, Sister Olson, do you think we're in the right place? I just let her wander around down here in the grass and for about 20 minutes. And after about 20 minutes, I went to her and I said, well, Sister O, what do you think? And she had a whole fistful of papers. And she said, something's wrong. So what do you mean something's wrong? She said, well, here, you read it. And she gave it to me, and it was her great-grandfather, John Isaac Wardle's journal. And the journal said that when the rescuers came into the cove, that he thought they were the meanest people in the whole world because they made them go over a little hill and cut 3 trees for firewood. And he didn't want to do that. Well, she looked around and she said, I don't see any little hills. And there aren't any. But yet this journal said he went over a little hill and cut 3 trees. Well, we were down there in the grass, and my stake clerk's son, who was a deacon, who's now on a mission in Paraguay, said, President Lorimer, what about that little hill right there? So I don't know, let's go look. So we'd never been over there. So we came up over this little hill, and right there, we found the 3 tree stumps. They were cut with an axe and they're cedar. They're of that vintage. We can't prove that they for sure are those 3 trees, but the journal was there and there were the trees. And as you can imagine, Sister Olson lost it. I mean, to realize that her great-grandfather, a member of the Martin Company, had in all likelihood cut those 3 trees down. The tree stumps are still here, and people like to see them. This is one of President Hinckley's favorite places, this and Rock Creek. President Faust's Rocky Ridge. President Hinckley, the day of the dedication of Martin's Cove's monument, which you'll see on the way out that we built in 1992, at that time, this was all under the control of the Sons, and the only way you could get in here was to drive up on top of this sand dune. You can't do it anymore because it'll erode away. But we had my Suburban up there, and we had them tell them some stories. And after the stories, the President wanted to see the tree stumps. So I ran down the hill, because even after all these years, I'm still the youngest member of the stake presidency. I ran down the hill, and I was going to show them the trees. And as I was running down this hill, I heard this voice, and he said, "Mother, you stay up there." And I turned around and looked, and President came shooting right past me, and he beat me down here. And as it turned out, he tore the cartilage in his knee, and he never told anybody about it, but he had surgery on it that December. And we took him over and showed him the 3 tree stumps. In May of 1997, when we dedicated it, he had me take him back up there to see the tree stumps. So when you see him, you'll realize that that's a special place, not just to us, but to the prophet. The story that we tell usually about Martin's Cove, President Faust says he thinks it's the greatest love story of the church. What happened here was a lot of suffering and a lot of sadness, but there was also some pretty neat things that happened here. When the first Church News article came out, we began to get lots of letters. My counselor, President McKinnon, came to presidency meeting one Sunday, and he said, "I got a call from a lady from Rexburg, Idaho, and she wants us to find her great-grandfather. No, she wants us to find the man who was engaged to her great-grandmother." And I said, "Well, President, that's real simple. Just tell her it's her great-grandfather." And he said, "No, it's not that easy." He said, "She was engaged to him, and they wanted to wait to get to Salt Lake to get married, but he died in Martin's Cove, and the family doesn't know who he is." I said, "Well, if they don't know who he is, how can we ever figure it out?" He said, "I don't know, but we're going to find him." So my counselors went about trying to find him, and they thought if they were engaged, they probably got on the ship together. Well, they got the ship's log out. Sarah Ann Franks was her name. She got on the ship with a family of 5 children. She was acting kind of as a nanny to them. And there was no eligible bachelors anywhere around where she got on the ship. So I said, "Well, that didn't work. Now let's move on to something else." And they said, "No, we're going to find this guy." They said, "Well, we're going to go and we're going to search the companies and see if we can find any eligible bachelors about her age." Well, they found like 19 of them. And I said, "Well, now what are you going to do?" They said, "Well, we're going to see if any of these 19 bachelors are from her hometown." So they did that, and 5 of them, I think, were. And they said, "Well, now we're going to take these 5 and see if any of them died in Martin's Cove." And 3 of them did. And this was taking a lot of time. We were building monuments, doing temple work, and all this stuff. And my counselors are fooling around, trying to find this guy that nobody knows who he is. And I said, "Why don't you guys just pick one and send it to him?" And President Kitchen said, "No way, we're not doing that." I said, "Well, the family doesn't know. We can't figure it out. Just send them all 3 names and say it's one of these 3 and let them pick one." And they said, "Nope, we're going to find him." Well, a few weeks later, I got a letter from, of all places, Johannesburg, South Africa. And in the letter was 4 pages of a handwritten journal. And in the journal on page 3, there's one sentence. All it says is Sarah Ann Franks is betrothed to George Padley. We had the guy's name. It was about 10 o'clock. I called both my counselors and said, what were those 3 guys' names? I know who it is. And they said, we can't remember. So we met up at the stake center, and sure enough, George Padley was one of the 3 that we had identified. Then we could put the whole story together for the family from journals. What happened is George Padley was a young man. He risked his life over on the North Platte at the last crossing of the Platte down by Casper, and spent a lot of time in the water helping the pioneers across the river. It's not the famous crossing we all read about, but nonetheless it had the same effect. George Padley never ever recovered. He got this far and died. Sarah Ann Franks so loved George Padley that she didn't want the wolves to eat him. So she took off one of the only things she had to stay warm. It was her shawl. She had the brethren roll his body into the shawl and had it hung in one of these trees on the other side over here so that the wolves wouldn't get him. She asked the brethren when they came back the next summer to give George Padley a proper burial. By that time, his body had decayed and fallen out of the shawl, and all that was left in the tree was the shawl. And the last thing that Sarah Ann Franks saw when she left here was George Padley's body in that tree. When we were up on the hill with President Faust, my counselor told him that story. President Faust became very, very emotional. And he said, President Lorimer, did you seal Sarah Ann Franks to George Padley? I said, no, sir, we didn't. We couldn't. Because she was taken into the Thomas Mackey home. And in the Thomas Mackey home, she eventually married Brother Mackey as a 3rd plural wife. She had children. I've met many of the descendants of Sarah Ann Franks. They're wonderful, wonderful people. I said, President, we couldn't seal her to George Padley because she'd already been sealed. And at that time, a woman could only be sealed to one man. The President stood up here on this hill and sorry, these people are pretty close to us. He had tears in his eyes and he said, President Lorimer, you go back to the temple. And you seal Sarah Ann Franks to George Padley. He said, you give her a choice. The only reason they weren't sealed is because George Padley gave his life so that others might live. Knowing Sarah Ann Franks like we do, we know that she was happy with Thomas Mackey, but her true love was George Padley. There's no question in my mind that George Padley wants her as his eternal companion, and that she wants her own husband, not a plural husband. Sarah Ann Franks is now sealed to George Padley. And I don't know how that'll all sort out, but I'm glad President Faust made the exception and allowed us to do that. That was a great day in the temple. It was a spiritual feast to do that. It could only be done with the authorization of a member of the Quorum of the 12 or First Presidency. And now the policy of the church is that you can do that. We've often wondered if Sarah Ann Franks had anything to do with that. I don't know if she did or not, but the fact is it has been changed since that happened. There's many other stories that we could tell you about the Cove, but I know we need to move on. But let me just tell you one modern day story that happened over here. After President Hinckley came down and looked at the stumps, we went over on that side of the Cove. We had always in our minds thought that this is probably where they camped and that that's probably where they took the dead, but we didn't know. President Hinckley, when he was over on that side of the Cove, and you'll see a big dead tree laying there. The 4 of us were standing there, my 2 counselors and I and President Hinckley, along with Brother Sayre. President Hinckley stood there, and all of a sudden just took his hat off and knelt down and said, "Brethren, we are on sacred ground. This is where they brought the dead." That to us was confirmation enough that this is the right place. This is Martin's Cove. There's no plaque there. There's no intended to be any plaque there that says that that's what happened. I was there, and I bear testimony that a prophet of God knelt down there and said what he said. I was privileged to be there. It was like being with Moses. You didn't even want to breathe. You know, I don't know if you've had the privilege of being with those brethren, but there's times where they're a public figure that's giving a talk or dedicating something, and there's other times that they're prophets, and they're different. That day, standing there with him, I realized I was standing with Moses, Nephi, Abraham, and that some wonderful things were happening. Shortly after that is when he asked us to try to buy this or to get the easement. He always believed that this would happen. We're glad that it has. It's affected so many that have come here. In the early morning, even right now, if you're just quiet, there's a real peaceful feeling here. The suffering, the sadness, the hunger, the memory is still here. But more important, the memory of absolute devotion to the gospel is here. And I think it behooves all of us to kind of soak that in when we're in places like this, because they are special. They're sanctified by the sacrifices that were made here. And we're just glad you're all here. And I don't know if you have any questions about any of this. We'd be glad to answer them. We haven't found any artifacts here. We've looked a little, but not very much. There was one found over on the other side that we gave to Sister Hinckley with the approval of the BLM. And there's one other one that I told some of you about that's down on our land that we found, an ox yoke pin. I think if you came in here with a metal detector, you'd probably find a lot of things. But they've just kind of left it the way it is. So that's Martin's Cove.